Hello, wonderful people. My name's Jesse James Grazier. I recently received my PhD in pharmacology, and I decided to make this YouTube channel to connect with people who are interested in some of the same things in science and just in life that I am. For those of you who don't know, a PhD is a doctorate in philosophy, and it can be in many different fields. However, mine was in pharmacology, the biological study of how drugs work. So my first video is going to be how science frees the mind with a rebel mindset. And I'm going to try to talk as simply as possible about things. However, I would first like to tell you what I'm mainly interested in science, which will make me use some technical terms that hopefully at the end of the 5 videos that I will release, you might understand a little bit more. So moving on, my main interest is in quantum biology. So cells aren't really just disorganized bags of water. They work collectively to give you life and to give even single cells behavior so they can look for food and move around and do the things that they need to do. So I think this works through something called holographic superradiance, which is when aromatic residues in proteins are aligned by liquid-liquid phase separation. And this is on the frontier of quantum biology right now. And I actually have a paper with all the details about this coming out in November. So I'm excited for that. And you can read the nuts and bolts of it. If you look up my dissertation, I talk about a little bit online, and you can find that on Google Scholar if you just type my name in. So moving on, what is this quantum stuff that I talk about? When people talk about quantum, what they're referring to is the wave-like behavior of particles of matter. So you can think about that from water passing through two slits. And when that water passes through two slits, you're going to make two waves coming out of both of those slits. They're going to have an interference pattern, and then what you're going to create is areas where the waves cancel each other out and you don't have any waves. And then when two high amplitude waves come together, it's going to create an even higher wave, which you can see right here. So we'll come back to this, but let's talk about science a little bit. And what is science? Well, to me, it's not really what you think, it's how you think. It's the most logical way for you to build your imagination to be more useful for you. It's not about proving theories wrong, really, in my view, because in the future, all theories are going to change. And they're going to have to change because things will evolve. So our minds must evolve with them. And they're going to evolve because the psychology of how people live is going to change. And also, people are going to change even on the molecular scale. And I show on the right just a rough estimate of how science has changed throughout the past few centuries. And these are just rough values of when these different fields were formalized. So you can see that in the 1600s, you had classical physics, and then in the early 1900s, you had quantum mechanics, where we started to understand this wave nature of matter, energy, and reality. So what's on YouTube about this a lot is the double slit experiment. And I thought an easy way to explain it would be using water waves, and then I'll get to talk about the double slit experiment and how you can think about it. So you can compare a quantum wave to a water wave because the individual water molecules in a wave can represent the individual regions of space that a quantum particle could be in at any given time, part of that wave. And you can think of that as a probability of it can be in all these different regions of space. So there's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and there's also Schrodinger's cat that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And you can think of this as the uncertainty in a quantum particle and where it's going to be in those regions of space. And if you try to look at the quantum particle very closely, you're going to lose information about the momentum of that quantum system. And you can think about that just as a water wave. If you zoom in and just look at one water molecule in that wave, you're going to lose information about the entirety of the wave, if it's a big wave or if it's a small wave, because you're just zoomed into that one water molecule. So that's one way you can think about it. So one way you can think about the double slit experiment is just thinking about throwing baseballs. If you throw baseballs through two slits, you're going to end up with two patterns that appear because the baseballs are going through those two slits. But then whenever you have electrons, since electrons act like a wave, they're going to interfere with each other and you're going to get an interference pattern, which is shown on the right. So another way you can think about this is, and if you would like to digest this wavelength formula and you enjoy doing math, I put this right here for you, but you can just understand it from the graph. Because why doesn't a baseball act like a quantum wave? Because the atoms and particles that make it up, of course, have wave-like nature. But it's just that a bunch of baseballs all have different atoms that combine to make it what it is. So the different atoms are going to cancel each other out because they all the different atoms have different wave functions associated with them. So the waves are gonna interfere and it's gonna cancel out and just be a very small wave you can see right here and compared to how big the baseball is. But if you have something like helium atoms, for instance, or a photon, which is a particle of light, or an electron, they can actually be coherent with one another because their waves can interfere with each other and potentiate and make a bigger wave. That's what coherence is. And you can understand why this happens because of the Planck's constant. The Planck's constant is the scale at which we observe this wave behavior. And it's a very small scale. It's actually a billionth of a billionth of a billionth about. So very, very small. But it's small enough to where a bunch of helium atoms or photons or electrons can pack together close enough to where their wave behavior can actually be coherent with another atom or particle. So then that whole system ends up acting like a wave. And that's why if you fire electrons through two slits, all the electrons are coherent with each other and are acting like a wave. And that's how a laser works too, is you have particles, photons that are all coherent with each other. So their wave pattern is being potentiated. So moving on, how I think this relates to biology is something called quantum scoring. You can have baseballs or golf balls thrown around a room and it's just going to create random patterns like this. But if you have a wave, because the wave has an interference pattern, if you send a wave on this same trajectory, it's going to end up making a pattern. So you can think about it that even in chaos, a pattern will emerge in a quantum system. So chaos in a quantum system isn't really chaotic. It has an inherent structure. So there's many different models that try to use a mathematical framework to try to approximate the energy landscapes of these quantum systems, of these quantum waves all mixing together. And I put 4 different versions of these models if you would like to look at them. But what they all have in common is they have fractal aspects, they're made of loops, and dodecahedron structure. So what all of these have in common is a dodecahedron structure, I believe, because you can have loops just like in loop quantum gravity in a dodecahedron structure, because you can imagine a big pentagon as a loop, a smaller pentagon as a loop, and everything, and a bunch of pentagons together creating a dodecahedron that can be stacked on one another is also like a bunch of loops, dynamic loops connected together. And this image is fractal because it can go inside of itself. These dodecahedron shapes can be generated inside and outside infinitely, which gives it fractal structure. So what is a fractal structure? Well, they actually use fractal models from Lorentz equations, which explains chaos theory and is also called the butterfly effect. I think that's the more common term. So the butterfly effect is that the initial conditions of a system greatly dictate how that system is going to progress. So we know that hurricanes can have many different possible paths based off the weather patterns that the Weather Channel and other news broadcasts try to show us. And I'm very familiar with this because I'm actually from South Louisiana. So I'm very familiar with hurricane paths and how unpredictable they can be. So I also think life uses this fractal geometry of chaos to organize things. And that's what we can see is that's seen in something called biomolecular condensates. So not all proteins are structured. We learn in school that proteins work like a lock and a key, and that's how they do work for a cell, is they bind things in a similar way how a key fits in a lock. Proteins will bind things and attach to it a certain way. But actually 40% of proteins are intrinsically disordered, at least in animals, about 40%. And that intrinsic disorder gives these proteins the ability to liquid-liquid phase separate. So that means it's going to organize water in a pattern that can organize different materials without the use of a membrane. And I think this is really interesting because since a membrane isn't needed to organize, this could be a key to the origin of life. Because we know RNA can replicate itself, and we know RNA can catalyze reactions, and that's known as the RNA world hypothesis, and that's the best hypothesis for the origin of life, I think. However, we don't know how these things could come together and how a membrane can be incorporated after. So one way I think it can is through liquid-liquid phase separation, because a membrane isn't needed, and disordered RNA molecules could actually mediate this effect and carry it out. So what's the path forward? I think the path forward would be understanding fractals better. We don't really have good math for fractals like we do for calculus. So we need to kind of create a mathematical framework, like a toolbox, if you will, for fractal calculus so we can understand their behavior. And I think that would help us understand nature more accurately. And once we do this, I think we'll be able to understand nature on all scales and realize that some of the randomness on the small scale is just a different magnification of the order we see, the fractal order we see on the large scale. So the take home, I think, simply is that cells are highly organized. Quantum biology will be one of the main fields of science in the future, and I'll elaborate on this on other videos. And the future will be great, and humanity will be able to explore creativity in the universe at every scale. So, I hope you enjoyed this, wonderful people, and I'll get started on the next videos. Have a good one.